Aloha, I'm Jack Dugan with Maui Now and Pacific Media Group. Today we're here in Wailuku, Maui at the Imua Discovery Garden. I'm going to sit down with Dean Wong, the Executive Director of Imua Family Services, to learn about his organization and how they've been handling the pandemic. All right, Dean, good to have you here. Thanks for taking the time.
No, it's delightful to be here. We're outside, so it's beautiful.
It's such a magnificent property every time I come here. Yeah. Well, wow, it's been a crazy last year and a half plus now.
It's been a year and a half. Feels like 10 years already, doesn't it?
It sure does, yeah. So maybe starting off, would you share a little bit about Imua Family Services, the organization, just kind of a high level of what you guys do, what you do for the community?
Yeah, absolutely. It's literally my favorite thing to talk about. So, stop me when you need to. Just historically, I think it's always important to know where you've come from as an organization, because I think it really does help set the course for where you're headed, what your future might be. And, what's interesting to me is that Imua Family Services is now celebrating its 75th anniversary. We started in 1947, if you can imagine that. Hawaii was not yet a state, we were still a territory. And what's interesting to me is that we started during a pandemic. Polio was the pandemic at the time that was inflicting children and many people, across the world. And I was looking back at historical data as to what was happening, with polio during that time, because 1947, when Imua Family Services started in helping children who were really suffering with the impacts of polio, there was a lot of things happening in our communities, like people not being able to swim together in the same bodies of water, and closing public pools. And in theaters at the time, people were forced to sit apart from each other and separated. Wow. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And so the organization started like many nonprofits do. They start where there's a need that isn't being met within the community, either because of government resources or medical resources that don't exist, or just or human rights advocacies that don't exist at the time. And so when there's a gap for people's needs, that's often where a nonprofit begins. And that was true for Imua Family Services, starting to help children who were suffering the impacts of polio at the time. And we've continued to grow and develop over the course of these 75 years to continue to meet the needs of children. And we've grown with what those needs have been. So polio, at some point, we had a vaccine and we were able to eradicate polio, but the organization continued to meet the needs of children with all kinds of special needs, all kinds of, whether it was premature birth, fetal alcohol syndrome, autism services, disabilities of any sort. So the organization just kept growing and adapting, utilizing the experience that they gained along the way to continue to help children and families here in Maui County. So Maui, Molokai, and Lanai, and now it's been 75 years.
Wow, remarkable. Thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah.
What a story.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, so here we are again in a new pandemic, and we've, as an organization, had to continue to adapt, as we have been doing all of these years, to meet new needs that children are having as a result of this pandemic. So, I like to say that our mission statement is to empower children and their families so they can reach their full potential. And, that's an indication of how the organization has grown over the years, because it's not about, children meeting a standardized, or a status quo, or being able to all be the same. We've learned over the years to embrace diversity and to be inclusive as an organization, and really help build an entire community to support children. But just that every child has its ability to reach whatever their potential is, right? So that they can live their fullest life and they can have connection with other people, which is really the most important potential that they can have, that we can all have.
Great, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And Maui County focus, correct?
Yeah, the organization has always been here specifically for Maui County. And sure, when I look back at the history of the organization, which I have all of the historical documents of our organization in my office, and I look back on them often, and I reflect on some of the things that we started as an organization that we still do today, because they've been so effective working with children and families. Yeah. And I look back on things that have literally maybe come and gone because we've adapted our services, or we've adapted the modalities of the services that we're providing. But it's always been very focused on doing whatever was best for children. And interestingly enough, when I look back at those historical documents too, there was a lot of vision from the board of directors and the parent. They called them auxiliary groups that started the organization at the time. And they were looking ahead to therapies and modalities of services for children that didn't exist in Hawaii at the time. They talk early on about, that there's this field of speech language pathology. And if we could get a speech pathologist here in Hawaii, that maybe they could service Oahu and the Department of Education and Imua Family Services and help all of the children. So, they were thinking very progressively about the kinds of services and the kinds of therapies that were available and how to get those here in Hawaii. And it's still our biggest obstacle today. When I'm looking at the kinds of therapists that we need to do our pediatric services for our children today, I'm still recruiting from outside of Hawaii and all around the world to get the most qualified people that can provide pediatric services to our children. So we're still doing that today.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all that, Dean. It really makes a lot of sense, and it's good to hear what you guys are doing. Now, a lot changed, right, in March 2020, right around that time frame for us all, the whole world. And it's clear it's affected, every business and organization in a lot of different ways. Maybe before talking about that, though, how did the organization operate as it's related to fundraising and events? I know you've had some wonderful events and different activities that you guys have done, but maybe a little bit of looking back at what it was like before the pandemic hit, and then we can talk about how things are today as well.
Right. Well, I think it's important when you are looking back at how an organization was doing financially. I think it's important that you're not just looking back to 2019 or leading up to 2020. I think you have to look at any organization or any business for that matter and see how they were doing overall. Because wherever you were at that time financially, the resources you had or the resources that you didn't have, while all of that did get impacted by the pandemic, it's really important to know, were you ready for anything, whether it was a pandemic or whether it was a hurricane? How prepared were we for any disaster that could happen, or just simply the market crashing, right, like it did in 2008. So I think it's important as an organization that you're sort of always thinking long term, and I don't want to say worst case scenario, but that you have plans in place for what should happen if this goes away. And I'll give you an example, is that I think historically there's a lot of nonprofits that might rely heavily on government funding, right? They might rely on whether it's a contract from the Department of Health or the Department of Education or Department of Health and Human Services, whatever it is, but you're relying on some sort of a government funded opportunity to create a program. And you always have to keep in mind, well, what happens when that funding goes away? As it so easily can with government funding, because maybe it's based on administration priorities, maybe it's based on whether that particular need still exists, moving forward. And I have that experience from previously working in a nonprofit organization, which was the Maui AIDS Foundation. And as an example, when I started in that work, it was during an AIDS epidemic, the crisis that was happening. A lot of funding was filtered through the Centers for Disease Control to focus on HIV/AIDS prevention, right? Especially here with Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations. But slowly, as the disease started to change and case management and support and medications progressed for that funding, that government funding that supported that at the time, it started to dwindle and go away. And so one has to be prepared for, well, what happens when that happens? What are the needs that still exist? And how do we continue to survive? So I've always said, and this is my own personal, stand as an executive director, that the best case scenario is to have as many diversified sources of funding as possible, because then in diversification, right, when one of those things goes away, you have other legs that you can stand on. So to your point, talking about fundraising, well, yes, I think we were moving along pretty steadily with building fundraisers and the reputations of fundraisers to support various programs that were, the fundraising was specifically there to fill in the gaps where maybe government funding wasn't providing the resources for. And so that's why we have fundraisers, right, to fill in those pukas and those needs. So yes, March 2020 came, and actually I recall that we were literally 2 weeks out from our largest signature fundraiser of the year when I had to make a little video and tell all of our supporters that that event wasn't going to happen, that we were going into lockdown and that event was canceled, you know. And that was a huge blow to us financially as an organization, because we had built up that fundraiser to be a staple part of our budget. And I think that's true for many nonprofits, right? If you have a fundraiser that is successful, it's able to support the organization's budget on an annual basis, or at least a portion of that. So we really had to think fast about how we were going to adapt, even though it was one event, it impacted the entire year's budget. And so a lot of adaptation had to happen to start to make up that difference.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, Dean, you're not the type to sit on your hands and just wait for things to happen. I look at you as someone that's been an innovator and certainly a driving force in growing and meeting needs, and as you've described, evolving and adapting. What's next? What are you looking at as far as the future right now, and how you guys are able to adapt with the dynamic?
Sure. Well, you know, certainly we had to adapt in our most immediate situation, right? How were we going to provide services to children? Because the services we provide are so critical to a child's development, right? 90% of a child's development happens within the first 5 years, from birth to about age 5. And so that's not time we're going to get back, right? We couldn't say, you know what, we'll wait till this pandemic's over and it's safer for us to get back in touch with our children and our families. We literally had to keep going. So we had to move forward and adapt in the safest ways that were possible, both for the families and the children, but also for our staff. So there was immediate adaptation, which we did, and with determination that we weren't going to let these children not get what they needed from us, right? So it meant putting a little bit on the line, you know, for our staff. There was some stress, anxiety, and fear around the fact that we were taking a certain amount of risk, but we were reducing that risk to the best of our ability, because we knew it was critical that these families would continue to get what we needed. But to your point, in terms of what you're asking, this is where it's so important for an organization to have a vision. When things come up, you know, we have to adapt to them in the immediate need, but we have to have a plan that, you know, that will take us into the future. When I think about Imua Family Services being 75 years old now, what it tells me is that we, with the right kind of planning and the right kind of vision, will see our centennial celebration, right? An organization that is 75 years old should be able to see its 100th year anniversary. And so when we think about the organization, we plan for 100 years from now. What are we doing, not 100 years from now, but what are we doing at that 100-year point? What are we doing in 25 years from now? And where you're sitting is part of it, right? We launched a capital campaign to purchase this 6 acres of historic property in beautiful Wailuku in central Maui in June of 2020. So right in the very heat of the pandemic, when there was so much uncertainty. But it was because we had a plan, and the plan extended way beyond COVID-19. And if anything, COVID-19 affirmed for me that we were in the right direction. We learned through COVID that we're actually safer outdoors, right? That we could continue to do more outdoors with fresh air and with nature around us, and that children could continue to come together in a way if we could find an outdoor place for them to do that. So really what COVID did for me is it really just solidified the fact that we were moving in the right direction, and that we needed to make this dream happen. It needed to become a reality. So while yes, it was difficult, or it is difficult to fundraise during a pandemic when there's so much financial stress, I guess is the better way to put it, we forged forward. And while maybe it hasn't happened as quickly as I would have liked for it to happen, it is still happening, because more and more people are seeing that the direction and the vision that we have for the organization and the kind of work that we do is only going to benefit children in this county and the organization for the future if we can continue to succeed and meet our dreams and reach our goals.
When we're talking about needs of the community and children, obviously how important is that here and looking after our own communities as you guys do? In speaking about the pandemic, I believe you said once before that the needs can increase, right? I mean, the actual needs of the community, of the children of our community increase, and yet the ability to meet those needs may decrease, or at least from a financial perspective, yes, to empower you guys. How do you manage that now?
Well, this is always, I think, going to be the case historically, right? So whenever there is any kind of a crisis, whether it's a crisis that's illness, or whether it's nature related, or whether it's the economy, right? What happens is that human need tends to rise, right? Because of added stress, anxiety, maybe depression, just sickness and disease in itself, or, you know, in the case of a hurricane or an earthquake or a major fire, right, where people lose their homes, right? So human need and suffering increases in a time of crisis. And then, of course, as the need increases, the resources are spread more thinly, right? And or they don't exist, or they go away because of whatever that crisis is. Like when suddenly everybody stopped working. And then how do we have an economy? And if you don't have an economy, then how do you support the increasing needs? So there's this, I don't even know what you call it, but it's it's awful, but that's the case. And it's been that way through history. So, you know, you dig deeper, right? And people get more involved, and some community members start to advocate more, or they start physically volunteering more. Like you see when there's like where we saw during COVID, where people were supplying food and resources and driving meals to our rural communities, and, you know, more people get involved. So what happens is people start to come together and decide how we're going to meet the need and fill the gaps of these resources, you know. Nonprofit organizations exist because we have always been able to do more with a single dollar than government. And that's not a criticism of government, it's just a fact. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of people that have to, you know, stamp things and sign things and move things around before that dollar can be spent. Typically, a single dollar that goes to a nonprofit organization gets distributed right out to meet needs of their constituents right away, right? The people who need it, you know. And good organizations, good nonprofits will be able to spend 90 cents of every dollar, you know, directly meeting the needs of their community.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It was really, I was following you, I think, when you were talking about the team and the commitment, and regardless of the situation or the money, at times, you know, more volunteers, more just digging in, it sounded like, was really kind of more of a coming from the core spirit and commitment and vision, as you said, about what you're here for and what you're doing, and truly committed to meeting the needs regardless of the circumstances, and looking at the longer term and the longer vision of it. It's pretty inspiring. Yeah,
hopefully what comes when there is, you know, such a crisis in a community is that people come together and there's more of a sense of we, you know, and less of a sense of me, right? That's what we need. That's what you need to come out of the crisis, right? And I mean, this is just my own opinion, but I want to say that before COVID, I think that our sense of me was maybe at the highest it had been in a number of years, you know? And so now I think we've had the opportunity to learn that if we want to come through something like this, we're going to have to come through it together, you know? So by joining our forces and coming through together, we can't all just operate separately and individually, you know? We have to come together.
What a good message, I like it. Thanks for sharing, Dean. Is there anything else you just want to share with the community, to the Maui Now audience, and anyone else out there, maybe others in the tough but important nonprofit sector?
In the tough but the nonprofit sector, I would just say, you know, to my colleagues that are in the nonprofit sector, you know, is to find, you know, to become secure in your vision. You know, if you have big dreams for your organization, for your nonprofit, for the community that you're serving, you know, then focus on those dreams. Like, focus on the big, bold picture, because that's what we need during a really difficult time. We need a dream to hang on to, right? You know, this incredible property, a lot of people might have thought, wow, this is insane what they're trying to do here, right? But what I see it as an opportunity, because The one opportunity that we have here in Hawaii and on our neighbor islands like Maui and Molokai and Lanai is that we have a distinctive water border around us, right? And we have a set size of our community. And I actually believe that as a community, we can provide all of the resources that we need as a community for each other. That there should be no stone left unturned, right? That every single child in this county that needs services can get the services that they need, right? That every homeless person should be able to get the services that they need, that everyone who's hungry should be able to get to the food that they need here, because we're a small community and we're a diverse community. And if we come together, like I was saying, I think that we could actually solve a lot of the socioeconomical problems that exist on our island. And then in doing that, we can become a model for other communities. You know, how did that island, you know, pull its resources together and meet the needs of the community that they had? Well, they did it by doing whatever it is, X, Y, and Z, and now other communities can start to look towards that and do that. You know, I think so often we tend to look outside of our islands to see what other people are doing, you know, to provide solutions for their community, when I think so much we have the framework here that we can provide it ourselves, you know, and then we can create a model that other people can follow. And that's really what we're hoping to do here.
Yeah, I think a lot of people believe that too.
Yeah.
Here, you know, you see that in our culture. So
I do.
awesome. I appreciate it, Dean. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome, of course.
Congratulations on everything you guys have accomplished, and, you know, thank you for what you've been doing for our community and the children of our community and the rest of the team on your organization.
Thanks.
Thanks for your time.